Good Friday afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the history of ranked choice voting in the United States. The webinar will begin shortly. My name is Chris Hughes, and I'm a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team. I will be your moderator for today's session, as well as the first presenter. First, a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference, since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizers so we may try to assist. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. Alternatively, you may email your questions or comments to info@rankedchoicevoting.org. To keep this webinar to about 45 minutes, and out of respect for your time, there will only be a brief question and answer session at the end. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website. Additionally, since we have two presenters today, you may see a transition screen or have a slight pause in the webinar as they switch controls for their portions of the presentation. Hopefully this will go smoothly and not cause any major technical issues. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center provides a compilation of best practices and first-hand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and the overall project serve as resources for voters, election administrators, policymakers, candidates, and others. The consulting team of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is not advocacy-focused. Rather, we aim to provide resources that allow jurisdictions to implement ranked choice voting effectively and efficiently. With extensive elections experience and working together overseeing statewide, municipal, and district RCV elections, our team has focused on expanding the resources and information available regarding the administration of and education about this voting method. We are available to discuss whether RCV is an option for your jurisdiction and to assist in developing implementation plans, processes for tabulating results, voter education, and more. Our services are free, including travel. As we continue our webinar series, we have two presenters with us today, one of them being me, to share their insight, our insight maybe, on the history of RCV. My name is Chris Hughes, and I'm a staff attorney at FairVote, and I serve as the liaison between FairVote and the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. I have a BA in International Studies from the University of Miami and earned my JD at NYU School of Law. Jack Santucci recently completed his Ph.D. at Georgetown University. His dissertation and book project explored the rise and fall of MultiWinner ranked choice voting in 24 American cities from 1915 to 1962. So I'll be starting off the webinar today by just explaining what we mean by ranked choice voting for both single winner contests and multi-winner contests. Single winner ranked choice voting is most appropriate for executive contests such as mayor, governor, president, etc., and is often referred to as instant runoff voting. It was first used in the United States in the state primaries in the early 20th century. Ranked choice voting is particularly effective when there are numerous candidates vying for a single executive seat, or where one faction's votes are split between two or more candidates. Rather than only voting for one candidate, candidates are ranked according to the voter's preference: first choice, second choice, third choice, and so forth. On election night, top choices are counted first. If there is no majority winner, a series of tabulation rounds is executed where the lowest vote getter is eliminated, and that candidate's ballots are counted for their next choice. In effect, a voter's ballot does not simply die when his or her first choice is defeated. While counting may stop when one candidate receives a majority of votes, a better gauge of community support is obtained when rounds are counted until only two candidates remain. Multi-winner ranked choice voting is the preferred option for electing a legislative body, such as the City Council, State Legislature, or the U.S. House of Representatives. It was first used in the United States in a number of cities in the early to mid-20th century, as will be covered by Jack later in this presentation. The great advantage of multi-winner RCV is that it ensures a diversity of winners. It assures both majority rule and fair minority representation without resorting to single-member districts. As with single-winner RCV, voters rank candidates and the top choices are counted first. Once those first choices are counted, a threshold of election is calculated according to the formula total votes cast divided by number of seats plus one vote. For example, with the 9-member Cambridge, Massachusetts Council, if there were 9,000 votes cast, the threshold would be 9,000 divided by 10 plus 1 vote, which equals 901 votes, or 10% plus 1. Candidates reaching the threshold are declared elected. there are additional rules governing how to transfer surplus votes, or votes candidates receive that give them a total greater than the threshold required, which you can learn more about on the How It Works tab of rankedchoicevoting.org. In sum, MultiWinner RCV assures that any substantial like-minded group can win representation roughly in proportion to its share of the vote in the represented jurisdiction. Now we'll give a brief walkthrough of our research into the early uses of SingleWinner RCV in the United States. Ranked choice voting was originally invented in Europe in the 1850s by Thomas Hare and Carl Andre. They each invented the method independently of the other, and they invented the multi-winner proportional form I just described. SingleWinner RCV was later devised in the 1870s by MIT architecture professor William Ware as a single-winner version of that previously invented multi-winner form. Ranked ballots were first used in the United States in about 10 states for their state-level primaries from the 1910s to the 1930s. SingleWinner RCV, in the form I described just a minute or so ago, was adopted in 4 states for their primaries: Florida, Indiana, Maryland, and Minnesota. Maryland and Minnesota ran a full ranked choice voting tabulation using 2 ranked ballots, meaning they would count first choices and eliminate whoever had the fewest first choices and count the next choice on those ballots, while Florida and Indiana eliminated all candidates but the top 2 vote getters. Voters whose first choices were eliminated in that batch elimination had their votes go towards whichever of the 2 remaining candidates was ranked highest on that ballot. Whoever had the most votes once those choices were counted won the election. It is unclear how many ranks voters were given in Florida and Indiana, so we expect to have a clearer idea soon. Buckland voting, a different form of voting using ranked ballots, was used in 6 states for their primaries: Alabama, Idaho, Louisiana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Washington State. Buckland voting uses ranked ballots as well. It counts first choices, and if no one wins a majority, adds second choices to those first choices without eliminating any candidates. Whoever has the most votes once first and second choices are counted wins the election. Buckland voting was used in about the same period as SingleWinner RCV for party primaries, but was repealed because it is highly susceptible to strategic voting and has not seen any modern uses in the United States. While we know that Maryland, Minnesota, Indiana, and Florida all used SingleWinner RCV, we've only been able to uncover the laws governing SingleWinner RCV in Maryland and Minnesota so far. Maryland's RCV law was passed in 1912 and applied to all state-level primaries. This means that voters voting in any primary for races such as governor, state house, or state senate were able to cast a ballot with both their first and second choices for that primary, using a ballot similar to the one pictured on this slide. Minnesota helpfully placed the exact ballot design for their ballots in their law, which is where I found this. Maryland's RCV law was used until 1939, when it was repealed because the second choices rarely, if ever, resulted in a person trailing the first choice count coming from behind to win. In other words, voters and parties, and legislators, for that matter, felt that giving voters an option to rank a second choice was not actually changing or improving the results of the election, and so eliminated the second choice ballot. RCV laws in Indiana and Florida were repealed for the same reason. Minnesota passed its RCV for primaries law just a year after Maryland and expanded the scope even further, applying RCV to state-level primaries as well as city primaries in cities with populations greater than 100,000, using the 2-ranked ballot pictured on this slide. Then, in 1915, the Minnesota Supreme Court found the city of Duluth's use of Buckland voting, which I described earlier, to be unconstitutional under Minnesota's state constitution. While Minnesota's primary law did not use Buckland voting, and the Minnesota Supreme Court went out of its way to say that this ruling did not necessarily apply to primary elections, the legislature was unsettled enough by this decision to repeal RCV in the state in 1917. This history merits further research given how little we actually know about these elections themselves and how people made use of their first and second choice votes. We are continuing to research it to try and find more voter data and hope to have more information on these uses of RCV soon. Now I'll turn it over to Jack to tell you about the history of MultiWinner RCV in the United States.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to share some insights from some of the spade work I've been doing on the use of MultiWinner RCV, or what these people would just call PR. And what we see on the right here is that at various points in time in American history, there were quite a few people voting under multi-winner ranked choice voting. We see that it tended to roll out in a state-by-state fashion. It sort of hits Ohio first in the 1920s and early 30s. Then there's a big rollout in New York City being the most prominent case. And then as we move into the 40s, it hits Massachusetts. The interesting thing is that the sustained advocacy, FairVote 1.0, if you will, takes form in 1893, and we don't see an adoption of any form of proportional voting until 1915. Then, by 1962, this thing is gone in every city but Cambridge. So I'm going to focus on 3 questions with the slides that are coming. One is why the gap between that start of advocacy in 1893 and the first adoption, and then why it was adopted at all in any of these cities, and why it was repealed. And I want to be clear that what I'm presenting is a hunch here, because we're really just starting to peel back the history of these cities. And a lot of what I have to say about the repeal in particular is based on Cincinnati, New York City, and Worcester, Massachusetts. I think we can organize this history by thinking about 2 big demands in society, or 2 social forces. One big demand is for the minority party to have some seats in a legislature, right? And then another big demand is to reduce the amount of control that party leaders have over nominations. And I think that these big demands structure a compromise that is made within the movement itself in 1914. They structure the coalitions that take shape to impose multi-winner RCV in these cities, and ultimately those decisions lead to problems, I think, of party discipline ultimately in some of these cities, and that's why we see it repealed. And I'll explain more on that in a minute. But just focusing on the bar plot on the right-hand side of this slide, you see these 2 demands illustrated. So we've got a Democratic Party, or a very large Republican Party, and let's say we have a group of independent Republicans, or quote, reform Republicans. That's how these people might have branded themselves in an adoption campaign. On the left-hand side of this bar plot, we see that the Republican Party has a legislative majority. It can pass whatever legislation it wants, right? And maybe we'll assume that the Democrats are getting a lot more votes than seats, that there's some serious disproportionality in the election result here. That's going to give the Democrats an incentive to want some form of PR. Now look at the purple people, these independent Republicans. Maybe these people are having trouble winning primaries. Maybe the best they can do is capture the primary in one district. That's going to give the these independent Republicans, an incentive to adopt some form of PR with low nomination controls. And on the right-hand side, you see where everybody's trying to get, which is a council with no legislative majority, where any number of coalitions is possible, right? We could have a coalition between Democrats and Republicans. We could have a coalition between Reform Republicans and Republicans. We could have a coalition between Democrats and Reform Republicans. The key point here is that each of these groups is going to have more bargaining power, right, in the resulting legislature after we get RCV up and running. So talking about the period between 1893 and 1915, there was a long debate about which PR method to use, which proportional system to use. One option was to have the party simply rank all the candidates and for voters to choose among parties, right? That would be what we call in political science a closed list proportional system. Another option was to have what we call an open list proportional system, which is to say the voter can decide which people within a party list they like the most, but they don't have the option to vote for people outside of that party list. And there were variants on these basic approaches debated, but what we got instead was a system where the voter ranks candidates without any restriction, otherwise known as multi-winner ranked choice voting. And add to this nomination by petition. So what I'm showing you on the right is a sample ballot from Worcester, Massachusetts, 1959, and you don't see party labels here. Really, parties don't have any sort of role in this ballot. You see who's an incumbent, right? You see who may have a last name that comes from an ethnic group like yours, and you see whether people come from a so-called good or bad address. So this is, this is fairly typical ballot. I should note that New York City did it very differently. Party labels did appear on the ballot in New York City, and I think that was the only city in which that was the case. So in any event, right, not everyone agreed that this nonpartisan approach, this weak parties approach to PR voting or ranked choice voting was the way to go. And in particular, the Socialist Party was a vocal opponent. That's what the photo of this guy is on the right. He's the press secretary for the Socialist Party, writing in 1913. And he's concerned that the absence of party labels on these ballots is going to deprive voters of critical information about the policies that various candidates stand for. And he writes that this nonpartisan form of PR is good for the banks and the railroads and the great daily, what he calls the great daily newspapers. He's afraid that because people depend so much for political information on print newspapers at this point, that the newspapers are going to end up able to dictate election outcomes. So in 1913, there's an effort to adopt something like an open list PR system. You can read more about that. There are primaries involved, but the important point is that parties had a fairly prominent place in that electoral system, and that referendum fails. So in 1914, there's a big compromise in the movement. On the one hand, the people who are pushing for minority party representation demand a rejection of initiative, referendum, and recall. Though their concern is that these initiative, referendum, and recall devices, which is to say the sort of institutions that allow a well-provisioned group to submit a law to the voters, they're worried that that's going to steamroll over the minority in the city. And then on the other hand, the people who are concerned about nomination control are reform Republicans, returning to the stylized example at the beginning of all this. They want a nonpartisan ballot. So everybody kind of comes together and says, you know what, we're going to do PRRCV, nomination by petition, and nonpartisan ballots. And sure enough, in 1915, you get the first adoption in Ashtabula, Ohio. And I'm showing you a photo here of Walter J. Millard, who was the field secretary for the Proportional Representation League. And this guy, for about, I don't know, 45, 50 years, just engaged in nonstop whistle-stop tours of the western states, the upper Midwest, New England, so on and so forth, telling people about what it would take to build the coalition to put this thing in place. Let me say one more thing about that. If you look at the bar plot on the right, I've categorized as best I can the adoption coalitions in each of the 24 cases, and we're still missing data on some of these. But what you see is that the overwhelming proportion of the cities with multi-winner ranked choice voting got that because some fragment of the formerly ruling party approached the minority party in the city, or vice versa, and they could agree, hey, let's put this thing into place, right? And I say, party split plus out party equals multi-winner RCV. Oops. There we go. As I implied in the slide with our reform Republicans, regular Republicans, and Democrats, there's no legislative majority coming out of an RCV election, and that, we still need to get laws passed. We need to organize the city council. So what happens in at least some cities, and we're still documenting the extent of this, is you get these pre-election coalitions, and the major example of this, and it was an example that the Proportional Representation League and National Municipal League then marketed all over the country alongside multi-winner ranked choice voting, was to combine the groups that had advanced PR in the first place. So in the Cincinnati case, the Republican Party splits in 1924. The, quote, reform Republicans join forces with the Democrats, and you end up with what appears to be a fairly rigid two-party system in the city, right? So the coalition in this case is the Charter Party, or the Charter Committee. And these other two examples, the CEA organization was in Worcester, Massachusetts. This was a coalition of the Republican Party and Reform Democrats. The CCA, Cambridge Civic Association, was the group in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Similar setup there. So you might think that these parties sort of gamed MultiWinner RCV, but that's not entirely true. They have to make strategic decisions about whom to endorse. And what they end up doing is endorsing people who are not entirely likely to be loyal partisans in council. Why do they do that? They do that when they are in the position of needing more seats to have a majority in the city council. So what you see on the right here is a scatter plot of parties in Cincinnati and Worcester. On the x-axis, you have a measure of the extent to which the candidates in these parties campaign as a team. What do I mean by that? Are they telling their voters to vote in a way that maximizes the election of, that maximizes the seats for the party, or are they telling their voters to vote in a way that maximizes their own election? And what you see is that on the right, to the extent that these people campaign as teams, so they tell their voters to vote for the party, you have higher levels of party discipline, which is what I'm showing on the left. And it gets a little more complicated. I'm not going to worry too much about the majority within a pre-election coalition. You know, we could deal with that in Q&A if you want. So, what happens? As a result of this sort of chase for candidates who would get you to a majority but not necessarily hold the party together in council, you get troubles within the coalition. And on the right, we have an example of this from Cincinnati in 1955. Focus on these C people on the left. By the way, that's Jack Gilligan. He became governor of Ohio at some point. Dorothy Dolby is our charter Republican. That's what CR means. The rest of these people are the Democrats in that pre-election coalition. And if two people appear near each other, that means they vote together in council a lot, right? And we see two clear divisions. You know, we see a big division between Republicans on the one hand, on the right-hand side of this plot, and the charter coalition on the left-hand side of this plot. But this line represents the division on a roll call vote related to labor unions in the city. The Democrats all vote together. I realize that some of these Democrats are very close to the line. Trust me, they all voted the same way on this. This is the result of the method that we use to plot this. Dorothy Dolby, however, the charter Republican, breaks with her coalition and goes with the Republicans on this vote. And there are a series of these votes. And this stuff really upsets the unions in Cincinnati in particular. And after, you know, surviving 4 repeal attempts with the support of the unions in Cincinnati, the 5th, you know, the AFL-CIO flies in from Washington, D.C. and says, that's enough. We're done with PR. We're going to help. We're going to help put an end to this thing. There's some nuance to the configuration of disloyalty that produces this stuff, and I want to focus on the Charter Coalition for just 1 second. You see that there are a lot of Democrats here, right? And there's only one Charter Republican. Presumably, if we can move back to some form of plurality voting, the Democrats are going to be able to swallow the Charter Republicans, right? Because they're stronger in the electorate. And that's sort of what gets you to a repeal. Beyond that, party discipline could suffer. Not just coalition discipline, but party discipline. And that is because it was really hard to regulate precisely who gets nominated. So what you see on the right here is a similar plot. This one is from New York City Council. Just as a interesting historical note, this is a resolution to fire Robert Moses. Some of you will know that he was responsible for the redevelopment of New York City and much of the current skyline. is his work. Moses does not end up getting fired. Mayor O'Dwyer does not honor the resolution. But the thing to note here is that the Republicans, these red guys, are kind of all over the space. They're not really voting with each other as a cohesive bloc. And this angers the Republican Party leadership. What you don't see in this plot is a change of endorsement strategy for mayoral elections in New York City that happens in 1945. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the pink people are the American Labor Party. And prior to 1945, they had been endorsing Fiorello LaGuardia in tandem with the Republican Party. After 1945, they're endorsing the Democrats, O'Dwyer. So, add it all up. What we have here is a Republican Party that doesn't vote as a bloc due to low levers of nomination control. And we have a large coalition change in the higher level institutions of city government. This leaves the Republicans without any control over policy outcomes in the city. And for that reason, they approached Tammany Hall in October of 1947 and say, that's it, we're done with this thing, enough. So my argument, and we'll see how this pans out in other cities, the roll call data are tough to get, is basically that if the second largest party had lost its ability to dictate policy, either because party discipline shattered in the New York City case you're looking at here, or because coalition discipline became a problem. That was the instance in which the charter Republican voted against the labor unions. The second largest party teamed up with the largest party, and what the second largest party thought it could do is swallow all those other small parties that were creating trouble for it. Now that said, right, we've got the historical arc of this here, and it sounds like, gee, this thing is fated to die. But the truth is that it lasted for quite a long time in some cities, 32 years in Cincinnati, a little longer than that in Hamilton, Ohio. And you can look at the length of those lines in the first plot I showed you, which listed the cities, showed you when they adopted it, showed you when they repealed it, and when there were repeal referenda. Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm going to throw it back to you.
Thanks, Jack. Let me get set up back over here.
All right.
Just going to steal presentation responsibilities back. All right, so I'm going to give a brief summary of the last 40 years of ranked choice voting in the United States, and then we'll head to our question and answer session. So the city of Ann Arbor adopted ranked choice voting in 1974 for its mayoral elections because a third party known as the Human Rights Party was acting as a spoiler in those mayoral elections. In the first and only election using single-winner RCV in Ann Arbor, held in 1975, a black Democrat won the mayoral election thanks to second and third choice votes from supporters of the Human Rights Party. Prior to this election, the Republican Party had regularly won mayoral elections in the city, so they challenged the law in court and lost, but then led a successful ballot initiative campaign to repeal RCV in Ann Arbor. Similar to these stories Jack is telling about repeals in other cities, is once the sort of second choice party in the city falls out of power, they find a way to remove this voting method. In the first, or let me restart. There was a nearly 30-year gap in new adoptions of RCV after that repeal in Ann Arbor in 1975. Interest in ranked choice voting began a resurgence, though, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, starting in San Francisco. MultiWinner RCV came close to passing there in the mid-1990s, and then a ballot initiative for single-winner RCV for Board of Supervisors, mayor, and city attorney races there passed in 2002. RCV was first used there in 2004 and is now used in 10 cities across the country, including multi-winner RCV elections in Cambridge, who retains their form of multi-winner RCV from the era Jack was just speaking about, and in Minneapolis. Another 6 cities have passed RCV laws but have not yet implemented it, generally due to the limitations of their voting systems. And the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is working with a number of those cities now to make sure that they can implement RCV effectively. Despite these limitations, RCV was used statewide in North Carolina in 2010 for a judicial vacancy election. This was the first statewide RCV used since the last RCV election in Maryland in 1938. RCV is also used by parties in 4 states for internal party primary elections and by 5 states in the South, plus the city of Springfield, Illinois, for their military and overseas voters. A citizen initiative passed in Maine in 2016, becoming the first statewide option for general elections, including single-winner RCV for governor, state senate, state house, U.S. House, and U.S. Senate, beginning in 2018. The Maine Supreme Judicial Court issued an advisory opinion in May of this year, stating that the use of RCV for governor, state senate, and state house races may be unconstitutional under the state's constitution, but that opinion is not binding, and at the moment the whole RCV law still stands in Maine. Single-winner ranked choice voting also passed in Benton County, Oregon for its countywide offices in 2016, making 2016 a pretty big year for RCV. And so far in 2017, another 19 states have seen RCV legislation introduced. In addition, the Fair Representation Act, which is FairVote's signature reform bill and proposes the adoption of multi-winner RCV for Congress, was introduced in the House by Representative Don Beyer in June of 2017. It's bill number HB 3057 if anyone is interested. And now for next steps, and then we'll get to our Q&A. Recording of the webinar and the post-webinar Q&A will be posted next week, and links will be sent to registrants and attendees of the webinar. Next on the docket for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center webinar series, we have our September 28th to 29th RCV webinar Blitz. We have 3 webinars in 2 days. The first will be a webinar on a usability study conducted by the Center for Civic Design on ballot design and ballot language best practices. Second will be a webinar on voting systems and equipment and their RCV capabilities presented by the Resource Center. And then finally, the Center for Civic Design will cover ranked choice voting results reporting and voter education best practices. We have a number of other webinars planned for the 4th quarter of the year, including an in-depth review of the impact of single-winner and multi-winner RCV methods. Now I'll pass it off to Karen if she is available to moderate our question and answer session. Karen,
we'll give it a shot. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey. Yay! It's bad when the technical person has technical difficulties, but thank you, everyone. So we're going to start our question and answer period now. If we're unable to address your question today, we will compile all the questions and responses along with a recording of this webinar, and we will be emailing that to you as participants within about a week. We'll also post it to our website, which is www.rankedchoicevoting.org. And last but not least, let me please take the time to, if you have the time, please complete the short survey at the end of our presentation. Questions today or at any time may be submitted using info@rankedchoicevoting.org. And so we do have a couple of questions. One is, I think I'm going to send this over to Jack, and Chris, chime in if you can or need to. How hard is RCV on organized parties?
Well, it depends what you call an organized party. I showed you that when parties needed to win more seats, they reached beyond their traditional support bases, and that led to lower levels of party cohesion in the subsequent legislatures. I think the question is, so compared to what? I mean, compared to a system in which the primary election dictates the winner, you're going to have more cohesion there, assuming the same people are winning primaries all over the place. So, there's that way of looking at it, right? That compared to the system of primaries in which we currently live, this is a bit hard on organized parties. On the other hand, you had very, very, very few people win seats in the 3 cities I look at anyway, without the endorsement of one of these parties. That is to say, without the endorsement of the CEA Democrats or regular Republican Party or regular Democratic Party in Worcester. And I have more data on that. So it's sort of in between. I can say more about that if people need.
Well, let's. It looks like maybe some of our other questions will touch on that. We do have several. And the next one I think does go back to something you were talking on. It's a sort of a point from one of our folks in California. I thought racism drove the Cincinnati repeal, as African Americans were getting elected to the city council as their numbers grew among the electorate. Is that something you can speak to, Jack?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have a paper that really digs into what the heck happened there, and it's quite clear that racism was widely deployed in the campaign to repeal PR there, and it is also it's also true that Dorothy Dolby, who was creating problems for the labor unions, was very much an ally of the civil rights movement in that city. The interesting thing is that the guy who summons the AFL-CIO to come into the city, right, and then who gets the 11,000 steel workers into the room to repeal this thing in 1957, he is also very much on the side of civil rights. And I have a whole bunch of roll call votes in which he and Ted Berry, right, are on the same side of fair employment practices legislation. So racism is a factor, you know, in Cincinnati and in New York City and possibly other cities, insofar as that's what it took to get people to really come out and vote against this thing. But the general story, I think, is one about trouble holding together legislative coalitions. You know, and a critical test case for that, I think, is Worcester, Massachusetts, where we don't have any colorful figures like a black Communist Party member such as Ben Davis in New York City, or a Ted Berry. You know, it's a very sort of humdrum politics there, and we can point to similar coalition pressures really killing the system in that city as well.
Very good. And I feel there's another question that sort of goes along with it. It was talking about just the role of race in general and red baiting and what that might have played in the repeal of proportional representation. Anything more you want to add to that?
Yeah, red baiting in the sense of mobilizing anti-communist sentiment in order to get rid of the system in New York City was definitely a factor. Another thing we see in New York City is the total fracturing of the American Labor Party. You know, the American Labor Party is the second largest party when PR kicks off in New York City, and over time its delegation shrinks. The Republicans become the second largest party. A critical factor there, I think, is a split in the American Labor Party over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, you know, just general leftist infighting. But again, you know, the general story here, what these cases seem to have in common is trouble holding together a legislative coalition.
Gotcha. I'm going to switch over to Chris now. I think this one goes along with some of the work I know he's done. Chris, do you think that MultiWinner RCV would stick better if instituted as a remedy for voting rights cases where minority interests are not being adequately represented?
I think that's a really interesting question because we've seen the adoption or the use of of alternative voting methods, if you will, as solutions to voting rights cases in the South. There's been the use of limited voting and cumulative voting, which are semi-proportional methods, thanks to voting rights cases. And those have stuck around for a while. I think part of the difficulty is so many of these towns are small and they're insular. And so we were interested in what happens in these elections, but we don't actually know for certain how they've been running these elections for a long time. So I think it'd be interesting to see. I think it would be a worthwhile experiment if the DOJ were interested in using MultiWinner RCV to solve Voting Rights Act cases. And I think those sorts of solutions could have legs, but it's a matter of making sure that the enforcement is strong and that they sort of have the bargaining power over these cities to get them to adopt alternative voting methods, because it's always been in smaller places and not larger jurisdictions where SCV would have or MultiWinner RCV would have a really big impact.
And the questions keep coming in. I'll send this one to you as well, Chris, and this one may be one Jack wants to chime in on. With the current adoptions of RCV in various cities, primaries, and states, do we expect history to be repeated? parties pushing to repeal and return to a plurality system when they don't get their way?
It's a great question, and it's something FairVote thinks a lot about. We work really hard to defend the wins we have while expanding the wins we've already gotten with ranked choice voting. I think especially when these voting methods are fresh in the minds of voters, they'll be really vulnerable because they won't be the expected and typical way of voting. And honestly, the biggest fight is getting them passed. And once you've gotten that done, it's about getting through the first 5 or 10 years and making it so that the voting method just becomes typical for voters, so people are just used to it. But I don't think these sorts of political pressures are ever going to totally go away, and it's just a matter of being ready to have that fight when it comes.
Jack, anything you want to add to that one?
I think that makes sense. Voters sort of tend to do what elite cues lead them to do, and you can have a lot of trouble counting ballots, and you can all sorts of operational challenges. But my take is that when a certain party, a well-positioned party, thinks this is going to hurt it, then that's when you get the pressure for repeal. Coming back to what's the future for multi-winner ranked choice. Lee Drutman had a really interesting piece earlier this week about how election outcomes are quite lopsided at the state level these days, right? Where you have disproportional outcomes in state legislatures, and I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not going to tell you this is going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if you saw increasing pressure, and maybe even some adoptions of multi-winner at the state level, where you have this dynamic where the minority party thinks, gee, hey, we could get more seats on this deal. Right? And then the majority party presumably has differences of opinion within it, and that's the raw material for more of these pro-PR coalitions. So, yeah.
We do have a question that pertains to voting equipment, and my apologies to our attendee who asked that. I'm going to hold off on that question for today because it goes off a little bit from what our topic is. We have a lot of information about how current voting equipment can help with the cost and ease of implementing RCV, and that was what the question pertained to. And I will say that we can answer that offline, and we will also be addressing that in our webinar on September the 28th regarding voting equipment and RCV. The other thing, I feel a little bit like Wolf Blitzer at the moment. I get to offer some breaking news out of Seattle. They filed a FairVote. Washington is filing their Seattle City Charter Amendment for RCV today. So thank you, Cindy, for alerting me that that is taking place today. That's exciting to see that RCV is continuing across the country. And I'm going to wrap it up with one last question, and honest to goodness, this did come through as a question. This is not a setup for you, Jack and Chris. I have been asked if there are any good books or articles that you would recommend on ranked choice voting history.
Is that for both of us or for Chris?
Well, I'll go to you, Mr. Book Writer, but I think both of you should answer it so it doesn't look like we've leaned in on your book.
All right, yeah. I mean, Daniel Prosterman has a new book called Defining Democracy, which is a sort of great narrative history of what happened in New York City, and it really focuses on the experience with the communists and sort of, says a lot about this. Says a lot about the race issue as well. As far as recent book goes, I mean, Kathy Barber's 1995 book on Ohio is the tome on this stuff. Anybody who even tangentially mentions PR in the United States will cite the Kathy Barber book. And then Doug Amy had a book that came out in two forms, one in 93 and another one in 2002, I want to say, which deals with this history as well and sort of makes the case for ranked choice, multi-winner ranked choice voting. What else? And then Lonnie Guinier has referred to this history in a bunch of different books. One of them is called The Miner's Canary, and she handles it from a voting rights angle there. So, I mean, there's more, obviously, but enough for now.
Chris, do you have any more to add to our reading list?
Yeah, so those are all great books, and they're all really focused on PR. I had a lot of trouble actually finding any good secondary sources on this sort of information. There was one book I found by Ben Riley called Democracy in Divided Societies that had just a couple pages on SingleWinner RCV uses in the United States. And there was an article from 1928, I can't remember, it was just called Primary Elections. And I'm forgetting the names of the authors right now, but those were my two big sources that were secondary that sort of collected a lot of this information. Otherwise, I had to just go searching through old session laws to figure out some of this stuff. And I'm hoping to turn this into something more substantial for FairVote too, to put out and collate.
Great. Well, we greatly appreciate everyone's attendance, and as we've mentioned before, we will be compiling these questions into a question and answers document that we will make as a supplemental post to our website and also send out through email with a recording of this webinar. We greatly appreciate your attendance. Hope you will join us for future webinars, and we'll share our information with friends, family, and colleagues as we continue to try to educate the public on ranked choice voting. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.